We are live. Zanita.
Hello.
There we go. Beautiful. How are you?
Me, I'm doing well. I just got back home to the Gold Coast, which is exciting. After being in Sydney last week with you in the office. So yeah, it's good to be back. It's good to be back on Record Live. Yeah, how are you?
Good question. Pretty good. Pretty good. Still having some nights of sleep deprivation with our little one. Not keen to sleep at night time. He's very keen to sleep during the day. Not so much at night, which is a bit topsy-turvy for all of us. But yeah, enjoying this sort of thing.
Yeah. Cool. Last week we had an awesome conversation with Paul Bogus. I've actually had heaps of reviews on this one. So if anyone listening hasn't watched it, go back to YouTube or Facebook. I was about to say MySpace, but that's a bit outdated.
Wow. MySpace. That takes me back.
Facebook or YouTube, and you can watch our conversation with Paul on relationships, which was awesome. I really enjoyed it.
Really good, really insightful, really helpful, practical tips for if you're in a relationship, and not just romantic relationships. I liked that we were able to sort of link in, family, friendship, relationships as well, because relationships are so important for us as humans. So that was a really good conversation.
Yeah, I had a lot of singles at Converge conference over the weekend tell me they enjoyed it too. So if you're not married, it's still awesome. And you can also apply some of those things to, friendships, communities, all those kinds of things as well. So it was good. Today, we have an interesting topic on hand, though.
We do.
What we titled it. What did we title it? We titled it "Who We Think We Are Versus Who We Actually Are," which is a bit mysterious. Do you want to tell us what you mean by that?
Very mysterious. Something I've been reflecting on. I heard a presentation at a conference called Empower about 2 weeks ago. This was a conference where all the AUC ministers got together. So from around Australia, every Seventh-day Adventist pastor pretty much in Australia was gathered at Avondale University to have professional development, to be inspired, I guess, to be served so they could go out and serve others in the churches, which is a cool concept. They do it sort of every 5 years, so it doesn't happen all the time. But there were some really good presentations there, and I didn't go for the whole time, obviously, but I popped up and saw some of the things that were happening. And Bill Knott, who I sort of keep an eye on, know about, I guess, because he has been the Adventist Review editor. So here in the South Pacific, we have Adventist Record. In the States, in the US, they have Adventist Review, and he also edited the Adventist World magazine, which we also carry here in the South Pacific. So he's kind of like made it in Adventist publishing. He's an editor, a very high up there editor in terms of what publications the church has, and he was editor for many years, probably much of my life that I can remember. He was there at Adventist Review. So he did a really good presentation, and in it I liked it because it was a story. He's a really good storyteller, and he told a lot of his personal testimony and how he relates to God's grace, and where that started for him in his life. And it was actually later than you might think for someone who was born and raised in the church as a Christian. And so his encounter with grace sort of changed his life, and he sort of talked about this concept, which I found really interesting. So I went away and reflected on it, and sort of as a writer, as I tend to do, I sort of wrote something myself, I guess, my own response to his concept that he'd given us. And the concept was that we all have two kinds of theology in our lives. We have the official church theology, or the ideal theology, the theology that we would give our belief to, our like nod to. If someone were to describe it to us, we'd say, yes, that is how I believe, that is how my belief works, my system of beliefs. And then we have a more of a practical theology, the theology that we live out, or theology that impacts our everyday life. Now, in an ideal world, your beliefs will impact your behavior, and those things will be very closely tied together. And yet he drew attention to the fact that it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes we can say we believe one thing, but our behavior or the way we live or the way we understand actually really unveils that we have a belief, a practical theology that is very different to the one that we say we believe. And I think that's an interesting conundrum to find ourselves in. I think it's helpful to be self-aware and to understand what we believe and why those beliefs will impact our behaviors and how that works.
So essentially, is what you're saying is we have what we say and what we do, and there's not always congruency between the two.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. In the presentation, did he give any explanation as to why? Or in your thoughts since listening, have you come up with anything?
That's a good question. He didn't necessarily go into it a lot. He gave more examples, I guess you could say. So again, he was telling stories of his life and helping us to understand that. And so I guess in my own life, I've seen a popular one or a common one amongst Adventists or amongst even many Christians is the idea of grace being through Jesus alone, through our belief, through faith, and through Jesus is what gives us grace. And depending on what kind of upbringing you've had, you're very comfortable to leave that statement there, or you want to modify that statement and say, but faith without works is dead. We'll add something like that, or we'll not be able to just leave that statement hanging there. It will make us feel something. It'll make us guilty, or it'll make us, oh, I need to do such and such. And so I guess he gave us some examples. Those examples help us to understand what it is and identify it and see that, hey, probably we all have things in our lives that fit that mold. But then on the flip side of that, I guess your question was, why do we do that? And I think that's a much broader question that goes to, I guess, human psychology, human motivation. It speaks to our makeup as human beings. I think there's something, often hypocrisy in the church is pointed out as a terrible thing. And you could say that if we think one way and act another way, we're hypocrites, right? And I think that would be painting it in a very simplistic way, because I don't think it's hypocrisy in terms as we understand hypocrisy. It's almost like a very negative thing in today's society. It's like you're doing something deliberately. You're deliberately obscuring by saying everyone should do one thing and doing another. I think the reality is a little more complex than that, because I think it's good to have ideals. It's good to have notions. And in fact, the Christian life is often about trying to be better than we started, to grow, to develop, to mature. Paul talks about starting on milk, but moving to meat, that sort of concept. And I think, so there's that upward development. And what it means is our learnt behaviors or our trauma impacted behaviors or our inherited things that we've seen our parents do and that we just sort of do automatically. Sometimes those things are different to what we say we believe, because we haven't sat down and figured out how to marry the two up.
Yeah. It reminds me what you're saying of, I believe it was Bruce Manners wrote an article in Signs of the Time talking about why we don't follow through with the things we say we want to follow through on. And he was kind of specifically talking in terms of at the beginning of the year, we set these new goals. And then most of us, we just like within a month just fail kind of thing. That idea of like, it's almost like when we look in Romans 7, and I think Paul or someone is saying, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, and what I do, all those like do, don't, da, 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 da. You can look it up in Romans 7, but
I've always liked that passage.
Yeah, that idea that like we have these ideas and we have these ideals, but when it actually comes to following through with them, a lot of us struggle with that. Which, look, I don't have the answer for that, but like I guess it's just a part of our human nature. But I guess like God has obviously set this ideal for us, and He has given us these like ways of life, and He has set an example, and so surely there must be a way that we can be better at this. Like maybe not perfect, but better.
Yeah, I think it comes down, I believe it's to do with God's character. For me, I want to make God's character and my understanding of God's character. I mean, theology, the word theology is like the study of God, a study of God, understanding concepts and ideas about God. And so our theology should be our understanding of God, but we should understand God's character. And God's character should be, He says things like, I am the Lord who doesn't change and stuff. And so we have, when we have a concept of God, we should see how our understanding of all the other concepts fit into God or Jesus and their character. And I don't think that we can hold Jesus and God separately in that way. We can't say, well, God's character is very much like angry, judgmental, and Jesus is friendly, meek and mild, loving. Yeah. We can't separate that. So when I say God's character, I mean the character of the Godhead, Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit. They have the same, they have a consistency of character. And I think that is the core of this issue, because if this cognitive dissonance, if it's causing us an issue, if it's causing us guilt, shame, confusion, not that we shouldn't have doubts, we will all have doubts at some point, but that we are actually wanting to walk away, perhaps even from faith, because it doesn't seem like what the church is teaching me, the theology that I understand to be true, either it doesn't work in real life, it's causing me to be something that I don't want to be, or causing me to treat other people in a terrible way. I think we need to make sure that those things match up. And I think for me, I try to do that by understanding God's character first and foremost. The whole point of the great controversy, which is a common theme in Adventism, which looks at history and how God has interacted with humanity through human history, right? And all of that is the purpose of the great controversy, is to reveal to the universe God's character. That's what I hear. That's what I understand when people talk about the great controversy. I immediately think God's character revealed. We're trying to reveal God's character through our understanding in that way. And so I think that actually God's character has to be the core of any theology that we hold. And then depending on what we believe about God is going to depend on how we act out our theology, how we practically live our theology. And that's when the dangers come in, and that's when the positives can come in. Because if we make God in our own image instead of, Him making us in His image, if we make God in our own image and we have a certain perspective of God, then we're going to act in that way.
Yeah.
It can be a dangerous thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like when you read a biography of someone, you're often learning, you're reading it to learn how they did something. So say I'm reading, if I'm reading Steve Jobs' book, I'm learning how he like created the best device in the world or whatever. And so I'm going to follow his habits or follow his way of life, which could lead me to making some awesome invention. But, in terms of his character, maybe that's not what I want to be following.
Right. But
so,
we should hope that God's character is one that we want to follow.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose it's like, depending on how you view that person's character, depends on how you act naturally. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, I guess for me, you've heard the saying, do as I say, not say as I do. What is it? Say as I... I've tongue-tied myself. Do as I say, not what I do, sort of thing. And it's like, Jesus came up against this with the Pharisees. They were putting burdens on the people, They were holding people to high expectations. And in some cases, they were doing it, but it was easier for them to do because they were already in that place. So it's very easy to say, don't eat, I don't know, radishes. If you hate eating if you hate radishes, it'd be very easy to hold to a religion that didn't eat radishes if you already hate them in the first place. And so in some ways, the Pharisees were doing a lot of stuff and they were expecting people who it wasn't part of their natural lives, but the Pharisees were like, no, that's what you have to do because that's what we feel like we have to do. And Jesus kept revealing to them God's character behind the principle that they were supposedly following. And so the principles aren't problematic. They're not wrong. The ideals of our faith are fine if the ideal, the practical, lived out experience of those ideals is actually consistent with what the ideals look like in the first place. Does that make sense? If that's God's character.
Yeah, sure. Do you think sometimes it can be more of a case of we have these spoken theological ideas, but still don't really understand the why for them?
100%.
Yeah.
100%. We don't understand the doctrine itself. We haven't... Someone else has come up with the doctrine and we've just agreed to it and accepted it without actually wrestling with it and its ramifications and the logistics of it. It may be... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking, it's almost like when you see, sometimes I live opposite the beach, and so every day I just see people running past my house. Like, everyone's just going for a run, and I'm often like, man, like, I want to be like them. Like, I want to be that motivated, and I want to be that fit, and I want to be like out running kilometers every morning before I start work. But then I think of like, but then I would have to sacrifice this. And then I would probably have to like eat like this. And then I start thinking of all the things of like how I would have to change or the things I would have to sacrifice in order to live like that. Even though it seems awesome, it seems great, there's like a cost to it. And so I wonder sometimes if it's the same with our walk with God or with our faith. Like, we understand it, but we don't really see the benefit of it. And we don't really want to sacrifice certain things for it.
Or it's hard, so we avoid it.
Hard, yeah.
Can be hard, yeah. And that's also, we stay in our comfort zones as people, and so how we live out our theology is not always what we believe, but it's just more comfortable for us. That's certainly an issue. And look, the point of this conversation is not to make anyone feel bad about not living up to the standards. I guess the reason I'm writing about this or thinking about this is that sometimes maybe our standards are wrong. Sometimes our understanding of God's character is wrong in the way we live it out. So, for example, the character of God being judgmental or angry, that might be the way that we live our practical theology out. That might be something that we would never say is true. We say God is love, right? And so that's our ideal theology. That's the way. But maybe how we've been treated by a parent, maybe how we've been taught about God growing up, maybe people have hammered into us certain principles and certain precepts that actually demonstrate that God is angry and is, a tyrant in the sky sort of thing. So we live like that's true, even though we have the view that God is love.
Sure.
So there's a disconnect there. There's a problem with our actual practical theology, our lived experience of that. We're not living to the full in Christ. We're not having that abundant life that he's promised because something's gone wrong, something in our. And so this is a challenge for me. When I heard this presentation, it was a challenge for me to look at my practice of my faith, and does it square up with my beliefs? And do my beliefs square up with the character of God? Do the things I believe actually hold consistently to God's character revealed in the Bible? Or are some of them cultural or traditional or just the way I've been brought up, or things that have been influenced by outside forces, outside culture, outside. And when I say outside, it's not an us against them thing. I guess I mean it's like there are a lot of influences that come into the church from culture. And sometimes we think those are church things. It's a good church thing to wear a tie. It's a good church thing to do such and such, have certain instruments at church or whatever. Those are actually cultural influences that have come into the church. They're not actually biblical principles necessarily. And yet we take them, we believe them, we live them. That's our practical theology. We live them like they are true. And yet they don't match up to God's ideal. And so I guess it's just, for me, it's being a bit self-analytical and looking at my faith and looking at my practice, and does it all square up? Does it help? Does it help me? Does it help my family? Does it help the world to know God's character better?
Yeah, I think that's a really good practical thing just to re-emphasize, is like by asking yourself, like, do my actions actually align with what I'm preaching or speaking? Or do my actions actually align with this theology that I'm believing, kind of thing? Because I think a lot of us, I think all of us actually could probably point out areas where our actions are incongruent with our beliefs, or the things we say, or the things we want, or I often find with myself, this is something that someone taught me once, was when I find myself saying that I should do something is when I should probably check in with myself. And I think this can apply with, like, when we think about faith or when we think about Christianity. It's kind of like what you said, I should wear a tie. Like, why? Like, who told you that? Like, why do you think you should do that? And it's kind of the same with, like, I should go to church. Or when we think we should go to church, are we kind of stepping away from that, like resting in God? Is that becoming a bit more of like a works thing? And so I think when we use that language of, like, I should do this, we're kind of doing it we can slip into doing it for a wrong motivation. And we're not really doing it because it's something that we really want to do, because we have this, like, negative association with the word should. And so we find ourselves saying that, but we automatically don't want to do it and probably aren't doing it for the right reasons, maybe. But does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so, because what you're saying is that we can be pushed. Well, that's where the guilt and the shame and stuff comes in, I think. And I think that's part of this, I like what you said about checking in with yourself, because you're analyzing your own emotions, understanding why it is that you're doing something. And if you're using language like I should do this, it's not an internal motivation, it's an external motivation. You're thinking, what do other people think about me? And if you're doing those things, I don't actually think God finds that as helpful as if you're doing it because you want to. God loves a cheerful giver, as an example of a verse. He talks to Isaiah about these people tithe their herbs, but they don't do it with a smile on their face. They abuse the downtrodden. They oppress other people. That's not what I want. Sacrifice. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Go away and think about what that means. That's what God sort of says in his frustration with these people. It's like, why are you doing things that just because you think I would like them, just because you think I want you to do them. No, I want you to actually reflect my character, be good people, live changed because of your interaction with me. Because I'm with you, you should be different. And I think that's important.
Yeah. What are some other, like, I guess you mentioned before, we want to be on this like uphill trajectory.
Yeah.
Instead of going backwards, instead of plateauing. What are some other things that we can practically do in order to like be more in line with what we are speaking?
I think one thing to do is, one thing I've found helpful in my writing and my speaking is to include myself in the story. So to look for ways that it would help me, so that I'm always preaching to myself. I'm always talking to myself. It's something I need help with, or something I have seen and wrestled with and not necessarily overcome, but seen how God is moving in that space. The reality is, if we preach and we teach, and I think we've spoken about this on Record Live before, but if we act like we've already made it, we're lying to ourselves and potentially to others, right? So those testimonies where I was baptized 25 years ago and I've been perfect ever since, I haven't touched a drop of alcohol. I haven't, we list these things off, and people listening to that go, I can't achieve that. I can't get to that level. It's too far. It's too hard. And even for ourselves, we self-deceive, and we talk about ideals all the time, ideal theology, ideal practice. But if we have to do that, we have to wear a mask, because we have to pretend that we've already made it. So I've found the humility of putting myself in the story and realizing that using inclusive language, like, it's something that I'm working on. It's something that I'm trying to wrestle with. It helps me to, it makes it less of an ideal pie in the sky. This is what we're aiming. This is what you should aim for. And it's more like, this is where we're all heading. So we're on that upward trajectory, rather than we're already there, when in reality, we're not already there. We're still fallen. We're still messed up. I think
there's also a level of vulnerability, and I guess vulnerability with people as to where you actually are.
I think we need vulnerability. I think we need openness. I think we need that transparency within appropriate bounds, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I think that's
live.
I think that's an important conversation. But I think it's an important principle, and it helps to give us humility, and it helps us to be a bit more what's the word, to have the two things more together, make more sense together, the two separate natures, the two separate theologies of ourselves. At the same time, we have to be careful in the being humble and being telling those transparent, open, vulnerable stories, because we can then trap ourselves in staying in a perpetual state of victimhood, or like, I'm rubbish, I'm down, I'm terrible. And we don't claim the victory that Christ has given us. So we don't embrace that side of Christ being the victor. Christ has already won the battle, and Christ can reclaim me and make me a better person. That's part of our theology too. Perhaps this is an example of how we can get things out of balance. It's not that we don't believe it. It's just that we don't live like it's true. So if I mope around all the time like, oh, I'm struggling with this, God's helping me, but I can never overcome certain things, and we're like really authentic and in the journey, but we don't live out Christ is the victor in our lives, we can also separate our ideals from how we're really living. And so I think it's important when we talk about things like being more open or using our own story to help other people come to grips with who God is, we've got to also embrace that victory, and that God is working in my life. He is causing miracles to happen. He is actually helping me in a practical sense in my life.
Yeah. I think it's a good point what you're talking about. Like, we don't actually live things out, because I think, like, one thing I've noticed is that I'm just going to put myself in a situation. I think like a lot of us do this, but I think we're so in the habit of like going to church or reading a book or listening to a podcast or whatever, talking about all this stuff. Like, we go to church and we do these things with good intentions, but then we come home and we forget about it, and then we just go back to our like 9 to 5 or our busy lives, and we don't actually like adopt the lifestyle of Jesus, or like we don't actually so I think it is also like, we're just lazy and distracted kind of thing, like a lot of the time as well.
Dare I say that we're Seventh-day Adventists, not 7 days Adventists?
Yes, I know.
Yes. I found a quote from Ellen White. I was researching something else, but I found this today that I thought might help this conversation. I think this is a good place to share it, Sanita.
Yeah.
No one is to think that all of his or her time is to be spent in study, because we're Protestants, we're Adventists, we're people of the book. We want to read and study our Bible, do devotions. So that head knowledge is very strong, but sometimes the heart and the action don't marry up with the head knowledge. This is speaking to that. When I read the word study, because it's repeated through here a bit, that's what we're talking about, the head knowledge. But by putting into practice what you study, you can obtain more than by merely studying. When you use your knowledge, you will find that more is given to you. Keep the channel open, that you may have the grace and light and love of Christ. Do not disappoint Christ, though you are teachers. You are to learn of the great teacher, while as students you are to respect the human instrumentality through which you receive instruction. You are to ever look beyond this to the divine. Then the truths which come from the lips of human teachers will be to you of a far greater importance than they otherwise would be. That was an excerpt from a paper called The Advocate in 1901. Very old wisdom, but still relevant today, I think. Don't just study, don't just understand a head knowledge, but by putting into practice what you study, she says you can obtain more than by merely studying. When you use your knowledge, you will find that more is given to you. And I think that sort of sums up what we're talking about today, putting into practice what you know.
Yeah, I like that. It's a cool, like, someone gave me the suggestion once just to read one verse instead of like 10 chapters, and then just see what you can practically take from that. So because I think you're right. As Adventists, we can just get obsessed with like studying and then not putting into practice. But I don't know. I think practicality is the key here. We always end on a practical note. I feel like we've already done that, but
we try. But it's very easy. This is my challenge to us this week. We always have a practical note at the end of record. We say, oh, maybe try inviting a friend home for, lunch, or maybe try, reaching out to such and such. How often do we actually do that? We talk about it, we find a practical application, but then we don't actually enact it. So this week, I guess that would be my takeaway. Let's be embodied, enacting the things that we believe and trying to find ways to bring our head knowledge out into our actual actions, our real life situations.
Yeah, I think one really good thing with this, or really important aspect of this, is often accountability. So maybe next week, Jared, I'll ask you how you went, and you can ask me how I went. And for anyone who's tuning in and listening, find yourself an accountability buddy and do the same. Or you can write in the comments if you did it or if you didn't, or how you went with applying some of these truths to your life. I think accountability is key. Who do we have? Linnell Laws says practice of knowledge is much harder than knowing. Yeah.
I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, it's been fun, Zanita. We better wrap it up, but we have a special guest next week.
We do.
We have Suki, an author of Sisters in Arms. This is a great book from Signs Publishing. It's about the women of the Reformation. We often hear about Martin Luther and others, heroes of the Reformation, but we don't often hear the stories of their sisters and their wives and their mothers and the people, the women that stood beside and with them in some of those battles. So we're going to have an interview with this author next week. It's going to be great, so don't miss out.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining another episode of Record Live, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.